He's not a game, not a game, not a game.
Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. I'm Bradley Tuck, and in today's episode, I have the real pleasure of talking to Doug Greene and Shalon van Tine about Marxism and Cultural Revolution. Shalon van Tine is a PhD student in cultural and intellectual history at Ohio University and an adjunct professor in the humanities at the University of Maryland's Global Campus. Doug Greene is an independent communist historian who is the author of Communist Insurgent, Blanky's Politics of Revolution, and A Failure of Vision, Michael Harrington and the Limits of Democratic Socialism. So in this session, we're going to be covering a vast range of Marxist thinkers, from Trotsky through to Mao Tse-Tung, Alexander Bogdanov, Bertolt Brecht, Walter Benjamin, Oscar Wilde, Theodore Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Jean-Luc Godard, and Marx himself. The session was recorded on the 9th of March 2021 as part of the Exploding Appendix Avantgarde Art Practice and Research Group, who meet regularly to explore radical ideas, the history of the avant-garde, and radical counterculture. So if you're interested in any of that and you'd like to get involved in our sessions, they're free and open to anyone. So just send me a message at explodingappendix@gmail.com, or if you like what we do and you want to find out more, visit www.explodingappendix.com, or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, SoundCloud, Twitter, or YouTube. And I think that's all I've got to say for now. So I'll hand over to Doug, Shalon, and the rest of the group. Doug's the author of Communist Insurgent, Blanky's Politics of Revolution with Haymarket Books. And then you've got another one coming out with Zero Books really soon on A Failure of Vision, Michael Harrington and the Limits of Democratic Socialism. And then Shalon van Tine, I know you're doing a kind of PhD at the moment, but you're also doing a number of different projects and potential book projects. One of the things that you're working on together is a project on Marxism and Cultural Revolution. So that's why I think this session came about. I was really enjoying your podcast with C. Derek Varn on Christopher Lasch, which I thought was really interesting the other day. So, and I also think both of you write really interesting work. So Shalon's got a website. I'm just forgetting is it just Shalon?
Just my name, shalonvantine.com. And I put all my stuff on there. So.
I found loads of stuff on Cosmonaut, but there are other places.
Yeah, the most relevant thing is that Doug and I both wrote an article for Cosmonaut not too long ago on Godard's film Lasch and Ross. So we'll probably talk about that.
Yes, I thought that would be a good one. There's also another interesting one which Doug wrote on Trotsky and Cultural Revolution on there.
Yes.
Which also seems really relevant. So I'm going to start with the first question. So whilst Marx himself is not primarily remembered as a kind of cultural theorist, his account of alienation in the economic and philosophical manuscripts tends to sort of lend itself to a kind of artistic critique of capitalism, whilst Capital itself seems sort of replete with literary references and allusions. So to what extent does Marx's thought lend itself to thinking about cultural revolution?
Quite a lot. That's the very short answer. To give a longer answer, I hope Shalon doesn't mind, this is a bit of a long answer. We have to step back before Marx for a minute to see what he's kind of responding to and what he's developing. So basically, you've seen dreams of socialism or communism basically since the beginning of class society. You know, when people imagine like some kind of idyllic society with no poverty, no war, everyone's equal, all of that. Great piece of literature that kind of does some of that is like Thomas More's Utopia. And even, you know, through slave society, through feudal society, you've seen revolts that sometimes have like these proto-communist elements to them. But before the rise of capitalism, this type of stuff, the material basis does not exist for communism, at least I would argue. But it's really with the rise of capitalism that you see a change, especially with the advent of the bourgeois revolutions, where you really see these kind of mass movements starting for communism. So in the English Revolution, you see radical Democrats like the Levelers, you see these proto-communists like the Diggers, and those are kind of a forerunner to what is coming as capitalism develops. And it's really with the French Revolution that I think modern communism takes shape. And I think we have to understand just how radical the French Revolution was. It's not only inspired by like the radical ideas of the Enlightenment and the contradictions in French society. But we have to understand that France, within a decade, goes from this absolutist feudal monarchy to developing the world's first modern democracy. Masses of people, peasants, workers, shopkeepers, they're taking to the streets and they're fighting. And even though the French Revolution creates basically the framework for a modern bourgeois society, the development of capitalist exploitation and that, it's not fought under the banner of let's exploit people. It's fought under the banner of liberté, equalité, fraternité. And the people there are fighting against feudal lords. In some cases, they're fighting against the new rising capitalist class. And with the advent of the Jacobins and Robespierre, you see an attempt they want a people who are fit for a modern democracy. There's a lot of talk in the Jacobins about virtue, about, love of homeland, love of your fellow man. Now, the Jacobin dictatorship doesn't quite last that long. When it does, it kind of shows this potential for a planned economy. It shows this potential of basically educating the people, because the Jacobins do try and do all kinds of things to educate the people. They create a civic religion, they revamp the education structure and whatnot. Now, after the Jacobins are overthrown, you see the first modern communists, people like Rakus Babeuf and the Conspiracy of Equals. These are people who are not utopians. They form organizations, they plan the seizure of power. What's kind of interesting is they think, this first generation of communists, that the people are generally, they're so ingrained in society. Society corrupts them with its values, with hierarchy, domination, that most people are not ready to rule themselves and create communism. So you kind of need this elite avant-garde that's going to take power, rule on behalf of the people till they're enlightened, and eventually that will go away and the people will rule themselves. And that's something that influences figures like Rakus Babeuf, Philippe Bonarati, and someone I've written extensively on, Auguste Blanqui, this idea that the people are not enlightened and that they need to be enlightened, but only a small group of educated bourgeois, special workers, they kind of come together in these underground conspiracies. The thing is, these type of organizations, they kind of leave the people out of the whole process of their own emancipation. And it's basically someone else is going to liberate you. And on the other hand, that's one tradition Marx is going to be responding to. Another is the Utopians. These are people like Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, Saint-Simon. There's others who often have very insightful criticisms of capitalist society, but they basically are like, we just need to form some kind of commune or philanthropy, go off in the wilderness and form our ideal society, and maybe we can appeal for funding from enlightened members of the ruling class. For them, there really is no social agent for change. Now, with Marx, there's a big change. Marx, I think, he really puts socialism on a much more firmer, as Engels would say, scientific basis. And this is the discovery of the proletariat. The proletariat, the working class, it's a special class created by capitalism. The working class, they produce basically most of the wealth. They're the reason the bourgeoisie exists. They're socially positioned that if they revolt, they can bring the whole edifice of society down. And according to Marx, the proletariat in liberating itself, and this is something else that's important, Marx is not looking for some kind of transcendental savior or some organ that's going to do it for the workers. He's saying the workers will liberate themselves. And this is part of, it's never actually used the phrase cultural revolution, but Marx says at one point in his work, the workers need to go through, they need to become fit to rule. And I don't see how you can interpret rule as anything less than undergoing a cultural and political transformation. So just kind of a few ideas about this. In the German ideology, he talks about, Marx and Engels talk about both the objective and subjective conditions for revolutions. And they say both for the production on a mass scale of this communist consciousness and for the success of the cause itself, the alteration of men on a mass scale is necessary, an alteration which can only take place in a practical movement, a revolution. This revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and becoming fit to found society anew. Now, this is written a few years after the economic and philosophical manuscripts, and part of the proletarian revolution, the communist revolution. Now, yes, it is to seize the means of production. It is to create democracy for the exploited majority, but it is also a change and transformation. And I think Marx understands this process in proletarian revolution, that for it to be a proletarian revolution, the workers need to liberate themselves. And it is also a mental aspect. And in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels say the communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involved the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. So if you look at what it takes for a revolution, you can't have a revolution with people who believe in subservience, the subjugation of women, colonialism, all this kind of muck. That has to change. People in the process of liberating themselves need to cast off those ideas. And there's another passage, and this actually ties into Blanqui a bit, from the class struggles in France. He actually identifies 4 aspects of communism, and he says, the proletariat rallies more and more around revolutionary communism, around revolutionary socialism, around communism, for which the bourgeoisie has itself invented the name of Blanqui. This socialism is the declaration of the permanence of the revolution, the class dictatorship of the proletariat as the necessary transit point to the abolition of class distinctions generally, to the abolition of all the relations of production on which they rest, to the abolition of all the social relations that correspond to these relations of production, to the revolutionizing of all the ideas that result from these social conditions. So as you can see, ideas, consciousness, it's all linked into these wider processes of economic, political transformation and revolution. And it's also important to note that when Marx and Engels, they look at the Paris Commune of 1871 as a separate example of this kind of future society. It's not just the people ruling, it's not just the people in arms. That's true, of course. But it's also the fact that culture is made available to people. These ordinary Parisian workers in 1871 are discussing ideas normal bourgeois society would say are just should be the province of philosophers and the elite. And suddenly people are remaking their whole lives. Now, the Paris Commune doesn't last super long, but it is kind of this first example of putting this idea into practice. So Marx and Engels, they are in their ideas, they're that come out of the French Revolution, but also linking what's rational in them about the need to overthrow class society, but linking it with the social agent, the proletariat, that to accomplish its liberation does require a cultural revolution. And they kind of form the basis of this. And yes, within Marxism, there are many branches, of course, but Marx and Engels, even if they never use the phrase cultural revolution itself, it's very clearly, my reading anyway, it's in there. And I think I've spoken for quite a bit, and now let's see if Shalon has anything to say.
Said a lot of the things that I was thinking as well. And, even though Marx is often thought of as, just strictly economic materialist, he's definitely talking about culture and consciousness and ideas in a way that applies to the material reality. And this is one of those things where I've often heard people sort of dismiss ideas about culture and a revolution in culture out of the notion that these are sort of secondary to economic concerns. But the reality is that culture and our cultural world and our material world are completely intertwined with each other. We don't just go to work every day and then, eat food and then live in a shelter. Like, every other aspect of our life is dominated by culture, our daily activities, our hobbies, our religious and traditional beliefs, how we entertain ourselves, how we create. All these things are cultural in nature. And if we're the type of people who want a revolution that upends capitalism, then we're also talking about, as Doug mentioned, a revolution in how we think and the types of activities that we do and participate in addition to how we're revolutionizing how we work. So these things are completely intertwined with each other. And if you're talking about an artistic critique of capitalism, as you mentioned, one of the things that Marx does talk about a lot in the economic and philosophic manuscripts is the notion of alienation. And, this is where he talks about how the worker only feels free in his animal functions when he's eating and drinking and procreating and in his dwelling. And this really looks like how our lives are like when we go to work all day and we're too tired to do anything that is intellectually stimulating. We end up just watching Netflix or, just sort of vegging out with our spare time. And that's because the labor process under capitalism wears down the worker to the point where they're too tired to study theory or to absorb high art or things like that. That's wrapped up in the way that capitalism keeps the worker down. So any sort of interpretation of Marx or any sort of Marx and any sort of reading of Marx naturally has, as Doug mentioned, built within it a revolution in culture in addition to a typical economic revolution.
Thank you for that. And also thank you for bringing in the French stuff as well, because I think the French stuff is also really, really important. Also, I think it's, if you think back to like David and stuff, it's actually a big moment where art and revolution seem to be coming together. Yeah, and then thanks also for the stuff on alienation, because I think I find the economic and philosophical manuscripts fascinating for that sort of way in which it brings in that sort of artistic element. Which sort of brings me on to the second kind of question. So in their manifesto towards a free revolutionary art, Trotsky, Rivera, and Breton quote Marx's The Freedom of the Press, saying, "The writer naturally must take money in order to live and write, but he should not under any circumstances live and write in order to make money. The writer by no means looks at his work as a means. It is an end in itself, and so little a means in eyes of himself and of others, that if necessary, he sacrifices his existence to the existence of his work. The first condition of the freedom of the press is that it is not a business activity." A similar sentiment appears in Oscar Wilde's The Soul of Man Under Socialism, where he criticizes the false individualism of private property and calls for an individualism grounded in socialism and artistic freedom. So how should we think about these demands for artistic freedom, individualism, and their relationship to a Marxist cultural revolution?
That's a great point. And there's like kind of this cliche under capitalism where we talk about the starving artist, the artist who refuses to compromise and they want to produce art according to whatever standard or means, but they're not getting quite the funding. So they're not really making quite a living. But if you think about it, it's like in order to, for the most part in capitalist society, if you want to be successful, your art has to be subjugated to the dollar. So a hypothetical example, let's say you want to make a socially conscious film, maybe there's some action in there and you have enough talent that you're able to get in the door at, say, a major film studio. They don't want to have anything that they produce that's going to be like really socially conscious. So they're probably going to water that down. And if you stick with it, if you're willing to compromise, you may get your name on those credits, but you'll probably come out with some bad generic action movie with some like wishy-washy liberal message. That's also at the compromise of your artistic integrity. So capitalism, it really does, if you look at like the mass production of a lot of art, it really is, squeezing out a lot of the talent, a lot of anyone who wants to be critical of society. I think it's also kind of just the alienation. Like when you're producing like for a studio, if you're a writer or whatever, your art belongs to that studio. They decide what to do with it. They can, use it to make profit, to turn it into a mascot or something. And that's alienating. I think one thing for under socialism, there's a wonderful phrase at I think the end of the first or the second section of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels say, create a society where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And in undergoing revolution, creating a society, it necessarily means getting rid of this type of alienation and the fact that art is subjugated to the whims of the market or profit, so that we don't have starving artists. That really shouldn't exist. Art should be valued and people should be encouraged to produce. So on that level, I think socialism, I think, as I understand it, I think as Marx understood it, is not like the erasure of one's individuality or one's artistic expression, but the opportunity to truly explore the range of it and actually the flowering of individuality in a society that's, it may seem contradictory, but is very communal. It allows for, the real development of human potential.
There's that Marx quote from German Ideology, I believe, that I'm going to badly paraphrase because I'm thinking of it off the top of my head, where he says, under socialism that, he can, fish in the morning and write poetry in the evening, or whatever the quote is. There's two things, in that question you asked. I mean, first, Trotsky, Rivera, and Breton, they're making a distinction, first of all, between a person making art as a living, as their form of work, versus a person making art for commercial gain, or I would even add on celebrity gain. So of course, we all live under capitalism now. We all have to work some sort of job that in some way probably supports capitalism. And that's what we have to do because we're workers, or we have to sell our labor for a wage. So I think they're first making that distinction. Second of all, Wilde in Soul of Man Under Socialism, he's particularly talking about in that work the idea of charity, but it also applies to artistic production as well. He says that, people are wasting their time trying to solve the problems caused by capitalism without taking away capitalism. And that just won't work. It's essentially a Band-Aid solution, trying to solve the problems, trying to basically build a house while it's still burning down, if you want to put it that way. One of the things that Doug mentioned here, which is incredibly relevant to Oscar Wilde's work and also the manifesto of free revolutionary art, is that currently art is created under the culture industry. And I'm sure we'll talk more about the culture industry in a bit. That's another way of saying that most art now is created under the capitalism's control. And most of that art will, of course, just prop up capitalism or prop up the industries that are making money off of that art, because the purpose of that art is not just art for art's sake or to be creative or to make something cool, but the entire purpose of art created under the culture industry is for profit. So because of that, there's never going to be art that can be truly revolutionary if its ultimate goal is to keep capitalism in place. Putting that another way, capitalism is not going to allow any sort of art that undermines capitalism. And we can see this in examples like Doug mentioned here, that whenever there's a movie or something that has slightly, rebellious themes in it, they always end up just being a sort of liberal message in the end, because liberalism works very well with the culture industry and capitalism. You never have anything that's saying that comes from the culture industry, that comes out of Hollywood and so forth, that's saying, let's unpin the system, let's take down capitalism, because that would be counterproductive for their own purposes. What Wilde is essentially getting at is that, and this is also what Marx is getting at in what you mentioned earlier in economic and philosophic manuscripts, is that the individual as an artist, the individual who wants to create, and all humans want to create in some form, even if we're not artists. I'm not an artist, but we still have our own ways that we want to create. You can only do that. You're very limited in creating that art if you're in a system that the only way you can survive, the only way you can make money, make a living doing that art is a system that's dominated by the culture industry. So the message, the reading between the lines message between all these works you've mentioned so far, is that in order for an artist to be truly free, to create art that's not bound by these forces, is to remove the forces altogether. That's what Wilde's talking about when he says that you're wasting your time if you're trying to solve the problems of capitalism without taking capitalism away.
Yeah, I really like actually how Oscar Wilde approaches that. It almost sort of takes something, it almost sounds like it takes something of the rights kind of narrative and then turns it on its head, as it were, or maybe a sort of libertarian rights kind of narrative. It seems like it's sort of maybe deterring something.
Yeah, I can I do see what you're saying, and that would be kind of characteristic of Wilde. I mean, he was kind of a funny figure. Probably this isn't relevant exactly to what we're talking about, but probably my favorite Wilde is The Importance of Being Earnest, which I made Doug watch one time. This was, Wilde was definitely the type of person who worked within satire very well. And I think that's typically been the one way that people can get away with making radical art under this current system, and the system that's existed for hundreds of years, is through satire and through making fun of it and sneaking it by people who, the upper ups, who don't really get it. So Wilde's one of those characters, I think, that found ways to still create good art, even though he was obviously restrained, and he was very aware of that.
I wanted to ask, like in particular in the last question, there was kind of this maybe in the last comment by Shalon, there was this idea that like the artist is constrained by kind of these forces of capitalism and kind of can escape them in maybe in this satire version. So I wanted to ask whether you think that maybe like a radical direction in art is always one which has a clearly revolutionary content.
That's a good question. I do think that most radical art, when it's radical, has a political element to it. And that can be revolutionary. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that something that we think is good art necessarily is revolutionary. That's not what I mean. But I do think that revolutionary art, or radical art, if you want to be more general, tends to be radical because it's creating works that are going against some sort of existing system. We can even look at this way back in art history before capitalism, before this current system that we have. All the major movements in art were, when they were new, radical rejections of previous movements in art. And often those were politically and culturally motivated. So I think you can kind of see this throughout art history, where, and you also see it in music too. The new movements that come about tend to be somewhat rejecting or responding to, something social or political happening before them. In the current world, though, I think that it's very difficult to make truly revolutionary art in our current state because the culture industry dominates so much of art. That doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily happen, because there are independent artistic movements, like this one. But they're small and they don't have a big imprint. I would say typically if you get a film or music or some sort of art form that remains revolutionary now, it's usually done outside of the culture industry, because once you're putting something out through Hollywood or some other culture industry, business, corporation, their purpose is always the bottom line. It's always profit making. So one example I can think of from the past couple of years is the movie Sorry to Bother You, which is revolutionary, and it was created by Boots Riley, who's a communist. And of course, this movie was created outside of the culture industry. I don't think he would have been able to make this movie in Hollywood because it had very radical themes about revolution in it. Of course, he had to make it out of his own funding. And luckily he has his own following, so he was able to do that. So he had funding for that sort of thing. But that's an example of what I would call a contemporary revolutionary film that was, of course, made outside of the culture industry, because once you're working within the culture industry, you're limited.
I think a good example of like a genre that kind of, which is could be very radical. If you look at The Clash, if you look at the Dead Kennedys, these were very radical bands with very left-wing messages, and there were all kinds of parental advice. A lot of people didn't want to touch them, but they were obviously responding to like the imposition of neoliberalism, the kind atomization of society that was coming or being implemented in Britain or the United States. But with like these type of bands, they were also politically engaged. Like a lot of like British punk I know is involved in like the anti-Nazi League, the Rock Against Racism back in the 70s. And here in the US, you had like Dead Kennedys, like Nazi punks fuck off. They're against like Central American intervention. Of course, as things like culture industry, you know, if they see a potential for profit, they're of course willing to go right in there, and they open up avenues for you, give you opportunities. And of course, you know, once you're kind of in there, it's very hard to be subversive inside these kinds of institutions. And I'm not saying like to dismiss all punk now, but it's not quite what it once was. There's also just the ability for capitalism to really co-opt things, even if they're very, you know, have revolutionary imagery. I think a great example, which is like the famous image of Che Guevara, which Che is, you know, like the quintessential revolutionary. You know, he gave his life for the revolutionary cause and everything, but his image is, you know, you can find it at like gift shops and everything. It's almost become like this empty signifier. It's just something like capital can make money off of.
Punk rock, and I would also add hip hop, these were both rebellious forms acting against corporate control over music, you know, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s. But as you mentioned, the culture industry does a very good job of finding what kids are into and finding things that seem rebellious and that can be marketed to teenagers, really, and gobbling them up, and often making, you know, their own versions of this, or putting those bands that started as subversive under their influence, and then they just become profit-making entities. But like Doug said, you know, punk rock and I'm adding hip hop, you know, these were things that were spawned directly out of kids in urban environments wanting to have control over their art. And especially within the punk movement, there was a key ideal, which was what's now called DIY, stands for do it yourself. The do it yourself ethos was a big part of punk rock. And of course, that sort of rebellion became commercialized as soon as the culture industry figured out that kids were into it. But that's something that happens all the time with the culture industry. As soon as you have something that's subversive or rebellious, Hollywood and, you know, Sony and then all these culture industries come in and basically commodify rebellion. And a good book that kind of talks about this starting to really happen a lot in the 1960s is Thomas Frank's Conquest of Cool. And he talks about how advertisers in the 1960s seen the counter-revolutionary kinds of vibe that was happening with the counterculture, how easily it was to start advertising products under these sort of counterculture images. And it just became another way to make profit. Sort of the lesson, I think, with all of this is that you can only really go so far as an artist or as somebody who's trying to fight against the system when you're under that system, when you're working within the system. I think the lesson here is that the system has to be dismantled from the ground up if you want true freedom as an artist.
Ask like a follow-up, like, but for example, so I'm not, I don't know much about the punk scene in the US, but so probably you would say that like maybe a song which was revolutionary back then, which might now be distributed by a major label or somewhere in some way, probably ceases to be revolutionary then in its content. And then like, what was the revolutionary kind of part of the original song? Maybe was it like, is it more like maybe in the context in which the song is then played, or like also in context in like how the band is using it, or where is the revolutionary content exactly of like, let's say a punk song when it was revolutionary?
This is just what comes to mind, but the Dead Kennedys had a lot of revolutionary kinds of ideas when they first started, a lot about war, a lot about anti-nuclear efforts. Some of the early punks, like the Minutemen, and, you know, they had a lot of anti-Reagan commentary as well. So that was a key theme in a lot of the punk of the 80s, was just sort of reacting against Reaganism. Another example I could probably think of would be the Riot Girl movement from the late 80s and early 90s. Well, and it kind of went into the early aughts as well, where women in the punk scene were creating a lot of works that were do-it-yourself, not under the corporate labels, although eventually many of those also became under corporate labels. But bands like Bikini Kill with Kathleen Hanna and stuff like that would probably be some examples of when they were still independent artists before being corporate owned.
What I'm thinking about is at the moment, a couple of friends and myself are, I don't know if you're aware of the book, The Necessity of Art by Ernst Fischer. We're reading that at the moment. And so I've been thinking a lot about kind of, capitalism's kind of inextricable link to artistic movements and how artistic movements are a reaction to the material society. And I often, as a kind of, as someone who wants to make films and films that don't exactly work in the kind of mainstream idea, it can be kind of demoralizing to think about art in this context. And so I was wondering if you saw any kind of healthy art or visual art movement today. And I was wondering also about, we talk about the cultural industry, and I agree with you, but there's also kind of a alternative industry as well that kind of is an industry in and of itself. Think about things like the Turner Prize or very high arts that's concentrated in the cities and concentrated in very elite universities, that kind of brands itself with progressive politics but is kind of still wrapped up in that neoliberal stranglehold. I don't know if I asked a question there, but
I think I see what you're getting at, which is that it is kind of demoralizing that the culture industry dominates so much of art. It is demoralizing. I think one thing to keep in mind is that, like you mentioned, there are independent art movements. It's just that they're small in comparison to things like Hollywood. So, I'm a huge film fan as well. I would say that like the best cinema that's being produced doesn't come out of Hollywood, and I would consider Hollywood as one of the key players in the culture industry. Now, unfortunately, like this is American cinema, which American cinema is, in comparison to other countries, subpar. And that's largely because of Hollywood. But some of the best films that I've seen are made from outside of the culture industry. To kind of answer what you were getting at, is that it is possible to work independently. It's just probably going to be harder, because if you're not selling out, then then you're going to have a harder time, gathering funds and that sort of thing to make the art you want to make. But it is possible. One of the probably best films I've seen in the past few years is Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I'm not sure if anyone saw that one. It's French, and I'm pretty sure that it was made independently, or that the director at least was independent at one point. So I don't know where she stands now. So, it is possible to make art independently outside of the culture industry's influence. The problem, though, comes in when the culture industry realizes that your art is popular and then can easily, buy it up and say, hey, we'll give you money. We'll give you all the money you need to make this other piece of work that will ultimately benefit them and not upending capitalism. So I think it's possible. I just think it's more difficult when you're working independently.
To think about the culture industry, I think, for one thing, Marx and Engels say, like, the epoch, the ruling class is the ruling ideas. And I think that's true generally, but I don't think we should interpret that in like a 1984 Orwellian sense that nothing ever gets through. If one of my favorite television series is Star Trek, and that has very left-wing themes. I don't think the current ones really do, but historically it has. And that's, worldwide global phenomena. And I sometimes rewatch episodes and like wondering how it ever got on TV. Another series, at least in its early seasons, was quite subversive, was The Simpsons. But it's also an example of this type of co-option. If you watch it now, it's not quite the same as it was in, say, 1994. Like, there was a lot of upending, like, of traditional, like, satirizing the American family, politicians, capitalists, and it was done like almost this kind of a Oscar Wilde type of satire, I think, at times. So I don't think we should ever view the culture industry itself as like just this kind of Orwellian phenomenon. But I mean, definitely bourgeois ideas are dominant, but things can appear in the cracks. I think it also an interesting medium is like YouTube. Like YouTube is obviously, corporate dominated and all that, but it is possible for people to produce some really great content. So I watch a regular series that does like a week by week on World War II, and it's as good as anything I've ever seen on like mainstream broadcasting documentaries like PBS or BBC or whatever. The producers of that are not really radical at all, but it's like the potential's there. And obviously this type of stuff can be gobbled up by corporations and whatnot, but the potential really is there. The internet really does open up many possibilities to share ideas, to share art forms. And I think leftists, at least I've noticed in the last few years, more leftists seem to have been using it more creatively, and that's good. I mean, the possibility is there to produce independent art. It always has been, really. It's just very difficult considering, the dominance of the culture industry and what have you.
I would just make a little note that Matt Groening from The Simpsons started out, of course, in the punk scene. He was writing comics. One of his more well-known comics was called Life in Hell, and they were printed in punk zines, which were do-it-yourself independent zine. He was another example of someone who did start as more of a radical figure and then became commercialized over time. I saw that somebody else posted a video on The Simpsons in there. That's actually, I'll second that video. That's a good one. That talks about why The Simpsons declined, and it talks essentially about this culture industry stuff that we're mentioning. But I also put another video in there that I did with the Theory channel Plastic Pills, specifically talking about the culture industry, if anybody wants to learn a little bit more about that, and particularly Adorno, which we'll probably talk about here anyway.
So in Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer write that the triumph of advertising in the culture industry is that consumers feel compelled to buy and use its products even though they see through them. Alongside writers like Benjamin, who I'm going to talk about, or we will talk about later, Adorno and Horkheimer were key theorists in the critical analysis of mass consumer society. However, Dialectic of Enlightenment is often viewed as a pessimistic text, where any potential escape appears blocked and revolution impossible. Is Dialectic of Enlightenment really this pessimistic? And does it eschew the need for a cultural revolution?
Well, I actually have a lot of things to say about that. I think that Adorno and Horkheimer's critique of the culture industry is probably one of the most relevant works to our current state of art and making art, even though it's often understood as elitist. Some people even think of it as anti-revolutionary, which I would disagree with. I think those are some kind of shallow readings of Adorno, which, to be fair, he is not easy to read, and that's partly due to translation. But contrary to these sorts of impressions, Adorno was a Marxist. He did believe that revolution was the only way to change our current predicament. I mean, in his Towards a New Manifesto, which is essentially a conversation between him and Horkheimer, he even said, reform of the administration cannot be brought about by peaceful means. He knows that the only way to change this is through revolution. It is important to keep in mind that Adorno was someone he was a Jew who fled Nazi Germany, and he saw firsthand the threat of fascism and fascism's power, only to come to America to see that, capitalism had become this behemoth and dominated every aspect of American life. So naturally, it's understandable that, someone gets a pessimistic view about the viability of revolution. But I do want to point out a couple things about that. First of all, there's a difference between not advocating for revolution at all versus thinking revolution won't happen in one's lifetime. The former is a political position that someone's taking, and the latter is more of a conclusion based on a set of data that you have in front of you. So I do think that there's a distinction there between being, completely against revolution, which he was not, versus thinking, okay, capitalism won and it's not going to happen. That's pessimistic, yes, but it is different than a overly optimistic or a completely counter-revolutionary position. There's another aspect of this work that's pessimistic too, but not quite pessimistic in the way that we use that word colloquially. I would say that Dialectic of Enlightenment, specifically critiqued an overly optimistic view that pervaded many branches of Marxist thought, which was where the Enlightenment thinking and science would solve all of our problems. If we just frame everything in a scientific sense and think about them rationally, then obviously the course of history will progress as it should. So in Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer are also critiquing this kind of thinking. While we can appreciate the Enlightenment for what it did, where it brought us scientific thinking and reasoning and away from like overly religious thinking, there were also some downsides to that way of thinking as well. It generated a way of looking at the world where everything could be dissected and labeled and scrutinized. And it created institutions that were intended, probably good intentions, intended to reform people who were out of step with society, but instead these institutions would become new forms of oppression, things like schools and prisons and mental institutions. This is the kind of stuff that people like Foucault talked about, and Christopher Lasch, of course. This is another form of pessimism that's in Dialectic of Enlightenment. It's a critique on a certain Enlightenment thinking, because there became a sort of cult of enlightenment, a cult of reason that surrounded that kind of thinking that dominated in a lot of different forms of Marxist thought that Adorno saw and Horkheimer saw issues with, because that kind of thinking can become mythologized on its own. It can become almost, to put it another way, it can become almost like its own religion. And then you have this weird adherence to science that then becomes irrational in itself. So yes, it is pessimistic. Another thing that is to note about that is that in some ways, though, it is a very sort of necessary pessimism, because there is an overly optimistic view amongst some strains of Marxism that can lead people to thinking that revolution is inevitably going to happen, that there's not going to be work involved, that there's not going to be violence involved. And that sort of optimism needs to be checked, because what will happen when someone is that optimistic about revolution is that it typically becomes opportunist. And, you see, like, speaking from an American context, being conciliatory to things like the Democratic Party. Well, and it just ends up being a lot of caving in on this and that until you basically have nothing that resembles the left at all. So a certain level of pessimism is actually, I would argue, a necessary thing for a Marxist, because it helps you prepare for all the possible bad situations. And we know this through outside of Marxism, just in psychology, that people who are more pessimistic minded rather than optimistic minded, pessimistic minded people tend to be better planners for the future. There's a lesson in that, I think, for Marxists. We need to have a certain healthy dose of bitter medicine. And Adorno is definitely that kind of person, saying, hey, look, you're way too optimistic about the kinds of revolution that you think can happen, through the culture industry, through capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. It's not going to happen that way. It won't be peaceful. You can't peacefully reform these institutions. They have to be taken away. I mean, we've already talked too about how the culture industry commodifies rebellion. That's just another example of that. I think a necessary pessimism is necessary. I think Adorno typically gets too much heat for that, but for the wrong reasons.
Shalon, a long time ago, actually probably gave me like the best explanation of Adorno I've ever heard on the culture industry, because the text itself is very difficult to grasp, I think, but she did a really excellent job way back when. So the thing I would add, though, in the text itself, I think there's a misreading often of Adorno, like calling people, like thinking he's saying people are stupid and whatnot. I don't think that's the case, actually. I think he's describing more what the culture industry does. So earlier, Shalon mentioned about, people getting off of work and being too tired to like read theory, just an example. And that's really true, because when you're using all like your alienated labor to enrich somebody all day for 8 or however many hours, you get home, probably not going to want to crack open the gun dresser, because your mind is too exhausted. So you're going to turn on television and you're going to watch something that is not going to tax your brain. Maybe you'll watch, I don't know, Jerry Springer or some really bad sitcom or whatever it is. That's not saying you're stupid. It's saying that the culture industry is trying to basically keep you in a state where you don't want to use your mind, where you don't want to do any deep thinking in your off hours. And that's why it promotes like these kind of like mindless, say, summer action blockbusters. It's escapism, if you think about it. That's what it's trying to do. And I think in a certain level, Adorno actually has a greater faith in people to get past that we're actually capable of using our mental facilities in a way that's not bound by how the culture industry does it. And I don't even think he's saying like there won't be bad art under socialism, but our ways of judging it will be so different because we won't have an institution like the culture industry there. So I don't have too much to say beyond that.
It was mentioned before the revolutions in between the art movements, right? And I was thinking that whenever this happens, it was like, if you think about like Dada and all this stuff, it was a critique on the aesthetic ideology of the movement behind it, right? And I was thinking, well, how is this, or how can it be different in the system in which, if you want art to go against capitalism, well, you need to critique some kind of system, right? It's not going to be the aesthetics of capitalism. It's going to be something more like deep, isn't it?
I think I know what you're saying. Are you assuming capitalism's demolished, we now have a communist society? Where does art go next? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is, how can art be properly revolutionary, and actually what does it mean to be properly revolutionary? Because and I kind of like step on the comparison that you did before, right? Which is how revolutions between art movements came in was a critique of some kind of specific part of the system, which is what mostly was aesthetic, right? And what I'm thinking is, what part of capitalism is the ideological part which has to be subverted specifically, so that you make the most damage with this art, right? Like, putting it in a kind of like a tongue-in-cheek way.
I do think that art today can critique capitalism. To clarify what I meant earlier, it's just that I think it has to be done independently, outside of the culture industry. And some of the best art does critique capitalism. Again, I think it has to be just outside of the culture industry, because once it's taken up by the culture industry, then it loses its revolutionary potential, if that makes sense.
In another kind of like more exploratory way, I was thinking about hip hop, right? Hip hop is an industry which was quickly adopted by the culture industry. I don't agree so much with the nature of counterculture of capitalism, like you said it, like for hip hop. And it was more a counterculture of racial oppression, basically. And I know they are linked, but I just want to make the separation right now. And I'm thinking about how, like, for example, if you think about songs like "Fight the Power" in LA, right, and "Fuck the Police," no, the other way around, like LA, it was East Coast and West Coast. They were made from a label, so they were made already from inside the culture industry. So this is what like my question was: what actually qualifies something to be revolutionary? Because I would qualify these songs as having some revolutionary content.
I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that first NWA record was an independent label. I could be wrong. But regardless, there's a lot of movies and music that have rebellious themes, but aren't necessarily revolutionary. And by revolutionary in this context, what I mean is against capitalism. I wouldn't say that bands like NWA were against capitalism. I don't think they had any calls for revolution against the system. They had calls against the system of police violence, which of course is wrapped up with capitalism, of course. But I don't think that, having listened to that record much in my youth, that they were making any calls for abolishing capitalism and, revolutionize, tearing down the state or anything like that. They were making calls against racial oppression and police violence and so forth. Those are more, I would say, definitely rebellious themes, rebelling against these bad things in society. But for something to be truly revolutionary in our modern context, I would say it would have to call for an abolition of capitalism. Like, that's the key thing. There are films out there, of course, that do critique capitalism in that way. But I would say that nowadays, those sorts of things that you're finding in arts are stemming from places that are more independent rather than from Hollywood. You're not getting it from Hollywood. You're not getting it from Sony Music Corporation. You know what I mean?
You've often had all kinds of stuff outside of, established culture industry, some of which is potentially very left-wing or subversive, some of which is definitely not. In the US, we've got like a large fundamentalist Christian culture that's not necessarily in the culture industry. It's really reactionary. It has no emancipatory content whatsoever. Just watch a Kevin Sorbo movie.
Yeah.
So couldn't resist that. But in terms of like culture being revolutionary, it often requires like revolutionary movements, revolutionary leadership, or at least that's how a lot of Marxists have seen it. So in the 1930s, in a lot of communist parties, they were trying to mobilize writers. Writers were almost seen as potential soldiers of the revolution. You had like the proletariat culture movements, literature movements in like the US. They actually had schools set up by the Communist Party to teach like working class writers to produce like poems, novels, short stories. That was part of a generalized, revolutionary assault on capitalism. And there was even some of this type of mobilization when explicit like proletarian themes were dropped, when you had like the Popular Front, but it was still seen like, as anti-fascist democratic values. And, just look at like the type of art produced during the Spanish Civil War, which was tied to like these anti-fascist themes. And I know we'll talk about Mao Tse-Tung later, but it's very like developed in him. And in the 60s, Shalon does mention about how the advertising industry picks up on a lot of themes of the counterculture, but there was, of course, mixed in with the counterculture, like the anti-war movement was crossed over. Some of the more politically new left groups were trying to mobilize that. So it's always been like a constant theme, like as like politics gets organized into like unions or political parties, if they're being revolutionary, they tend to try and see if they can actually mobilize artists for their cause. And that's both before and after, a potential seizure of power.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just something that kind of happens, it actually has to be organized. And there's almost like a conscious element in that.
Thanks. As a Latin American right now, I'm a little bit ashamed I didn't think about new Latin American song as first for the example. Like, like Victor Jara, and they were better examples.
Yeah, Oscar sort of stole my question. And I think Lawrence was along a similar theme. The question about how do I identify the revolutionary content in art? My intuition, I wanted to voice it. Maybe it's helpful to make a distinction between the content of the art, which in many ways could, in principle, contain revolutionary aspects. It could call for revolution. It could criticize capitalism. But what is its function? So what is its effect, the effect that it has on society? And I think that maybe that distinction is helpful for trying to evaluate when art is a truly revolutionary or not. Because I was sort of worried almost that, maybe this is pessimistic, that there's nothing in principle that means that the culture industry couldn't produce something that is vaguely revolutionary, because maybe it could do it in such a way that it's just a sign, it's just signposting, empty signposting that doesn't trigger people to take up genuine revolutionary stance. What in principle stops the culture industry from producing revolutionary content if it's able to take away that sort of functional aspect of revolutionary, you know what I mean? And then what is the culture industry? 30 years ago, you could identify very concrete institutions that are responsible for the production of most cultural artifacts, whereas today, you know, you have YouTubers and content creators, and a minority of them, a percentage of them, are fairly radical, you know, news outlets and so on. So what exactly is the culture industry today?
You know, the culture industry today is, of course, more of a conglomerate than it was when Adorno was talking in the immediate post-war years. So it's become, in many ways, more of a culture industry today than when he was even talking about it. So essentially, the culture industry is any industry that is controlling, I don't want to use the word controlling because that sounds conspiratorial, and it's not a conspiracy, it's just capitalism, but any industry that is producing cultural products. So you have movies, so Hollywood movies, you have the music industry, the film industry, the fashion industry. And here's the thing, the news industry. And this is where the culture, understanding the culture industry is really important for now, because the culture industry has one goal. They are essentially a business. And so whatever they produce, whether that's a film or a record, fashion, clothes, whatever they produce has one goal. And that goal is to generate profit. So they will produce things that are produced like a factory. And this gets into, I know Bradley wanted to talk about Walter Benjamin, but essentially the films and music and things that are pumped out now, they're pumped out in a factory kind of way, where they're made to be familiar, they're made to make you complacently entertained, and more importantly, they're intended to promote consumerism. So there are, of course, elements and films and music and stuff that have little bits of rebellious kinds of ideas wrapped up in them, because just in the way that like sex sells, rebellion also sells. People love entertainment things that seem to be fighting against a system that they instinctively knows exists, even if they're not Marxist. Just regular people know that everybody kind of knows, I think, that the system sucks, whatever their conception of the system might be. So these industries know this, and they purposely include rebellious elements into their products, and celebrities are a product as well in this, that make you feel as if by watching this, by participating in this art form, by enjoying this form of entertainment, I am, perhaps not consciously think this, but it makes you feel as if you are also rebelling against the system. And that's purposeful. And it functions in a way that creates a sort of complacency. This industry knows that people are overworked, and at the end of the day, they're not going to want to go home and listen to some atonal composition by a high modern composer, or, you know, analyze some high work of art or something like that. They want to just veg out and watch something that's entertaining. But there's still that sense where people are dissatisfied with the world. So they include rebellious notions that sort of feed that need to feel as if you're somehow, yeah, I'm against the system. The most recent example I can think of this is the Joker movie, you know, which was, you know, just not that great of a movie or anything, you know, but for a superhero movie, got a lot of press. It ended up being one of the biggest, most profitable movies. I think it beat like $1 billion or something. This movie was full of sorts of vague, rebellious themes in it, never actually calling for getting rid of capitalism, and you know, has a couple cartoonish Wall Street guys in it that they threw in there. Never actually gives any sort of specific rebellion against what it's against. You know, there's a sort of vague, like, oh, the healthcare system sucks and this and that, but it's just sort of vague rebellion. This is extremely profitable, and probably one of the best things that talks about this, that a much easier read than Adorno actually, would be Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, where the state of capitalism is essentially so ingrained in our society that we can't even conceptualize a world without it. It's just sort of built into everything we watch and listen to and experience. And this is really how the culture industry functions. Now, this is the key thing that's important to remember about the culture industry, which is that the culture industry also owns the news media. And this is probably the most important thing to take away, which is that, you know, the culture industry is not just some like amorphous abstract concept. You have like 5 or 6 companies, you know, they change. It's like GE, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, you know, a couple others that own all of these industries. So it's a real tangible industry. They own Hollywood, they own music, they own fashion, they own fast food, and they also own 90% of the news media, you know, all the television news and also some of the major newspapers. So this is where, I mean, if you think about this, the industries that are making our culture are also, they're making culture in order to be profitable. These are the same industries that are feeding us whatever political information we need to know about the world. They're feeding us our news. So our media is, of course, naturally wrapped up in also perpetuating capitalism. You see this mostly in advertising, the way that the news has become basically an entertainment show on television. This really started this in the 70s, and there's a good movie about it called Network from, I believe, 1976, where it starts to talk about the corporatization of news. And this has just become even more the case now, where there's only a handful of companies that own the majority of our news sources. So that's a lot to unpack, and I know I've talked too long here, but that's something to think about, is how the culture industry sort of dominates the narrative. And not only they're dominating art and culture, but they're also dominating how we consume our information about the world in the most basic political sense.
I think in a certain sense, Adorno and Horkheimer would not be super surprised about things like YouTube. Kind of does fit in. And at my YouTube, there used to be like no commercials whatsoever on it. I just watch a video, that's it. Now it's like every 5 minutes there's commercials. And of course, you know, the content decides what it's going to show me and whatnot. And it may not be, certainly like these large media companies like CBS, NBC, CNN, they have their own YouTube channels and they have the money in there to promote them and whatnot, and to pay for advertising and etc. I wouldn't see the individuals who have like a lot of these channels kind of like counter to the culture industry, but you know, they can just kind of be absorbed into it. I think there's just this continual dialectic involved in whatever type of medium we're talking about, of people who they see themselves as adversarial to the dominant, you know, culture industry, and they kind of just get absorbed into it. There are certainly exceptions to that. Like in film, a great example is actually George Lucas, who really did not like the studio system. And his franchises in many respects come to embody that, you know, Star Wars. And certainly like a lot of like YouTube celebrities have, you know, they've gone on to sell like millions of albums and whatnot and become almost institutions into themselves that, you know, kind of fit quite nicely into the dominant culture. So I think this kind of like culture industry adversarial is just a constant dialectic that's involved. I don't know if Shalon's got anything to add.
You know, advertising is really the thing. There is a little like hour-long documentary that came out maybe a decade ago called Generation Like, which was looking at the younger generation at the time, I guess it was millennials, who and was looking at their social media habits and how they like everything, you know, actually quote unquote like things and share things, and basically did not realize that in doing so, that every kind of information that you put on social media, every time you like something, every time you comment on something, every time you share something, you're essentially doing your own advertising. So you're essentially advertising to yourself. I'll often talk to people who are younger than me, from a younger generation, who have essentially grown up in the internet. They've grown up with YouTube and social media and just all of this just as a natural part of their existence. And I don't think many of them realize that how much advertising they're exposed to. The latest number I've seen, and this number is even a few years old now, is that the average person sees about 5,000 to 10,000 ads a day. And this is everything from all the products that we see that are branded to everything that you see online. It all feeds back to this advertising industry, which is directly connected to the culture industry. So I think advertising is, like Doug mentioned, the key thing there that ties things like YouTube to the culture industry.
I'm going to move on to the Russian Revolution. One of the things that I find really exciting about the Russian Revolutionary period is how much sort of innovation emerged in art, culture, and lifestyle during this period. Whether we're talking about machine music, montage in cinema, utopian science fiction, constructivist architecture, suprematism, agitprop performances, experiments in sort of communalism as well. So I get a sense that the Russian Revolution was itself a kind of cultural revolution, yet these artistic innovations did not always align with the Bolsheviks. So to what extent could this cultural revolution be seen as Marxist, and to what extent is it something else?
First thing to say is in the last few decades, there's been a segment of Soviet studies. It's kind of more revisionist to like the Cold War totalitarian paradigms. One of the really important figures in this is Sheila Fitzpatrick. She's written a lot of great stuff on the Russian Revolution. She's not a Marxist. She's kind of just a progressive scholar, but she's an excellent scholar. And one of her big books is she actually edited a collection on the Cultural Revolution in Russia. And she's done stuff on like the early Commissariat of Enlightenment and under Lunacharsky. So there really was, within the Russian Revolution, and I would go say from 1917 to roughly the middle of the 30s, there is this explosion of cultural energy, like you said, in architecture, in artwork, in songs, in whatever it is. So partly it is the state doing it. The state wants to promote its values. So for example, like the famous symbol of the Russian Revolution is the hammer and sickle, which, the Soviet state actually had a contest to come up with it. And that's how that was done. They wanted to protect and promote certain works of art, but ordinary people were activated by this revolution at all different levels. And they were they were doing communal living. They were coming up with new rituals for marriage, for funerals. In some cases, you had the state with like the League of the Godless trying to essentially just smash religion, but you had other people just trying their own individual experiments. Some of this aligned with the Communist Party's agenda. Some of it was just independent initiatives. One thing that's kind of interesting, at least for Lenin himself, is he was very conventional in a lot of his cultural tastes. He really wasn't into a lot of this avant-garde ideas, but he was kind of, for a lot of it, he's just like, let people do their own thing. And it wasn't like, these artists would necessarily be imprisoned or anything like that. And this kind of goes into like the 30s when they start developing the 5-year plans. And there is like attacks on bourgeois in like the universities who are technical experts. And some of this is, as the revolution kind of becomes more bureaucratized, Stalin is gaining more power and whatever. But there is also, in terms of the Russian Revolution, as they develop the 5-year plans, they need administrators, they need managers, they need educated people to help run in a modern society. So the avenues of universities, technical institutions are opened up, and working class and peasant people just by the hundreds of thousands get an education, which was not available, just decades before. So a lot of the people who ended up running the Soviet Union, they had gotten their education thanks to the 5-year plans, thanks to what had happened. And also in terms of the Soviet culture, there's like attacks on the traditional family, which is, of course, women stay in the kitchen, trying to liberate women, trying to, develop for the former colonial subjects of the Russian Empire their own alphabets, their own culture, music, etc. And just this real explosion. And it really kind of comes to an end, I would say, as the Soviet Union, by the 30s, they really are starting to institute more traditional Russian nationalism, authority, patriarchy, all of this type of stuff. And a lot of like these kind of cultural experiments they had welcomed or tolerated for the first 20 years or so, put on the kibosh.
To answer your question, Bradley, I would say absolutely yes, that the Russian Revolution was also a cultural revolution. You mentioned, montage and film, and I would say that cinema was probably one of the most impactful and revolutionary art forms to stem from the revolutionary period in Russia. So what made film so powerful at that time was not only that it was a new medium, of course. Film is really just sort of developing in the early 20th century, but that it had the power to reach people, many of whom were illiterate at the time. It had the power to reach people through just imagery. And there's a reason that Lenin, and I'm going to badly paraphrase him, I'm sorry, but Lenin said, of all the arts, for us, film is the most important. And there's obviously a reason that Lenin understood the power that cinema held for promoting ideas of the revolution to regular people. One of the things that's interesting about Soviet cinema is that it became a nationalized industry, so it became under control of the Communist Party. So they were able to use the film industry in Russia to promote specific communist themes. And one of the interesting things, if you watch a lot of the Soviet cinema chronologically, from the time of the revolution even through the end of Stalin, you can see an evolution in the cinema. So someone earlier mentioned how art forms can, be revolutionary. And then I think it was Rob who mentioned earlier, these forms can cease to be revolutionary in their later stages. You can kind of see this with Soviet cinema, actually. So some of the earliest Soviet films were incredibly revolutionary, explicitly revolutionary. They were propaganda films. When you get closer into the Stalin years, you see the films, they're still propaganda, but you see them shift more towards ideas like socialism in one country and very Stalinist kinds of ideas because they were completely under the control of Stalin. So Soviet cinema essentially kind of went through a few different periods. And in their early periods, from the time of the revolution to, about the time of the new economic policy, you can see sort of another phase with Stalin and modernization and the Great Purges and collectivization. And then you can see the sort of World War II years. And you can look at these films in a way that shows that they were adapted to fit the needs of the party at the time. Anything from enshrining these ideals of the revolution to solidifying the Bolsheviks' narrative of history and justifying their leadership, to especially the concept of what Sheila Fitzpatrick says of the new Soviet person and the ongoing struggle against class enemies and things like demonstrating how industrialization would improve the lives of regular people. And these are just a handful of these sorts of themes that you see in Soviet cinema. So my point being that Soviet film propaganda evolved in both the content, but also the style to reflect how the party and how the politics evolved. So, sort of the lesson there is that when communists have control over these industries, they were able to create cinema, much of it very good cinema, aesthetically speaking, that promoted completely explicitly revolutionary material.
So for Alexander Bogdanov, just as figures such as Diderot and the encyclopedists were important in creating a new world outlook for the bourgeois revolution, so too did the proletarian revolution require a proletarian culture to guide it. Trotsky, however, challenged this, saying, the proletariat acquires power for the purpose of doing away forever with class culture and to make way for human culture. How should we understand the differences between Bogdanov and Trotsky?
Bogdanov, for those who don't know, is a fascinating figure. He was an early Bolshevik party. He was a physician. He was a science fiction writer, actually wrote a novel called Red Star. And he actually died in an attempt to gain immortality through blood transfusions. But he actually broke with Lenin before 1910, and he developed this idea of proletarian culture, again, developing a specifically proletariat culture. I'm kind of simplifying just for the sake of this. And during the revolution that a movement kind of spawned, it was called the prolet cult. Again, I'm simplifying. I don't think this is actually Bogdanov's ideas, but in a sense, a lot of the pro cult, they thought, let's just ditch everything with, capitalist culture, class culture, and just embrace this kind of proletariat culture. And it should be noted, it's not just Trotsky who doesn't like this. It's actually Lenin who doesn't like this either. For Lenin and Trotsky, because I don't think there's a principal difference between them on this question, is they think Russia is so backward, and at this time it is so burdened with war and economic ruin. People just need to be able to absorb all the fruits of, bourgeois culture, and that should actually be made available to people by the revolution. So, like during the revolution itself, like some of the prolet cult, there was almost like an urge to let's smash all this. Whereas a lot of the Bolsheviks, they wanted to preserve like a lot of Russia's treasures. I don't think that was Bogdanov wanted to smash anything, but there definitely was kind of that impulse in some of the prolet cult. And there was the Commissariat of Enlightenment at times, which was basically, the Ministry of Education. At times gave encouragement, at times did not, to the prolet cult movement. Kind of died away partly through hostility from Lenin and the party. But there is this, but I think in a larger sense, what the prolet cult represents is this kind of tendency in any revolution to how much discontinuity do you want? Are we just going to have a straight year zero where we cut off everything from the past and just try and create this new culture from our revolution? Whereas figures like Lenin and Trotsky are like, we need to absorb all of that heritage from the past, not necessarily its reactionary aspects, but it's our culture. It's created by, working class people throughout history. For Trotsky, at least, he did not see a prolonged proletariat phase. He's this long transitional phase where a new culture could be institutionalized, but to get rid of the class content and have a truly human culture. And I'm not sure, I think considering it's been a century since a lot of that was written and debated, there certainly is a protected transitional period, for revolution where maybe it was more institutionalized, but I'm not sure it quite fell under prolet cult, and it certainly didn't fall under a generalized human culture. I don't know if Shalon's got anything to add.
I don't actually have much to add to that. I found a quote from Trotsky that I think kind of shows his inclinations here. And he says, "What the worker will take from Shakespeare, Goethe, Pushkin, or Dostoevsky will be a more complex idea of human personality, of its passions and feelings, a deeper and profounder understanding of its psychic forces, and of the role of the subconscious, etc. In the final analysis, the worker will become richer." And I think that Trotsky, along with, I would say, many of the key Marxist figures, would be against abolishing previous cultures, cultural products, art, and so forth in some sort of final communist world. I think the key thing to take away is that we can learn from all of these, from the history of art. There's value in it. Just because something isn't revolutionary doesn't mean it doesn't have value in some other human sort of way. So I think that Trotsky, along with Marx and others, would of course appreciate many of these classic works, because in the end, these are products of human culture, and they should be absorbed and studied and appreciated.
In Literature and Revolution, Trotsky writes that the wall will fall not only between art and industry, but simultaneously art and nature also. This is not meant in the sense of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that art will come nearer to the state of nature, but that nature will become more artificial. And in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, Walter Benjamin writes, from a photographic negative, for example, one can make any number of prints. To ask for the authentic print makes no sense. But the instant criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to the artistic production, the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, politics. In these two texts, Benjamin and Trotsky explore how changes in technology transform the relationship between man, nature, art, and authenticity. How does Marxism and its thinking through of technology challenge how we understand these categories?
That is a big question, like you said. There are really two overlapping ideas that I think are going on here with these quotations that you brought up. One is an aesthetic argument, and the other is a political one. So I do think that whether we're living in a capitalist society or communist society, we're always going to have different kinds of aesthetic criteria to judge art. Even if we abolish capitalism and then artists are free to make whatever, that doesn't mean that we're suddenly going to have a bunch of good art. We're probably going to have a bunch of art that sucks. The problem there is that the purpose of art becomes free, at least. You also have an aesthetic question there, and this really gets into Benjamin's idea of art having a particular aura when it's created by a person rather than a factory machine, you know, the way that the culture industry works. You can kind of look at the history of painting to see, if you look back at the end of the 19th century, when the advent of photography came around, there were plenty of people who were saying that, you know, photography does not count as art. For a long time, it didn't count as art, neither did film for that matter. It doesn't count as art because anybody could do it. Anybody could take a picture because the technology allows them to, and that it would undermine painting and the traditional arts that took years of skill that people had to perfect. And you can see the argument there, which is aesthetic, but also Benjamin is looking at how the industrialization is affecting art and culture. On another level, you also mentioned nature as well, and industrialization and its effects on nature. And I think all these things are, of course, connected. Some of the most interesting figures, I think, in my personal opinion, who talk about the effects of industrialization on nature are people who aren't actually Marxist. Some of them are Marxist adjacent or socialist adjacent, but people like Lewis Mumford or another Marx, Leo Marx, who essentially saw industrialization permanently changing our natural landscape of the world. And they saw that, especially for people like Lewis Mumford, that the modern age was characterized by capitalism, by militarism, by mechanization. These are the things that, man's rule over nature is now our permanent existence, and we have to deal with that. There's no sort of return to nature. There's no going back from the industrialization in the world, unless, of course, we go to some other planet or something and do things totally different. But here on Earth, there's no going back to some sort of pristine, natural, pre-industrial kind of era. We're in the post-industrial world now. This is another thing that we have to come to grips with as Marxists is, and this kind of strays a little bit from the question, but it goes into how our environment can support us. I won't go too much into that, but industrialization and the technology involved with that absolutely changes art and culture. And that the most easy way to see that is by what we've already talked about with the culture industry.
I think something interesting to add is like how this quest for authenticity, it plays into like so much of capitalist culture. I remember being a kid looking through magazines on Star Wars action figures, telling me, well, this is the authentic figure, but this is the fake. It's like, even though the fake actually looked better than the authentic one. So like, why is one fake and one authentic? Well, it's because it's branded with the company logo on it. And there's so much of that you have a knockoff, and it's, it has this, that whole collector's industry, trying to find the authentic. And it's also like, have you actually seen, like, I've seen the Mona Lisa, but I've only ever seen pictures of it. I've never actually been to the museum to see the original painting of the Mona Lisa. And I suspect that's true for probably most people here. Have you actually seen the Mona Lisa? Just having seen that. But on the other hand, it's like, having things like photography and mass production, it makes this available to millions of people who would not otherwise have seen the Mona Lisa, even if it's in a picture. And it's, on the one hand, I think that that's a good thing to actually have that. And in terms of division between art and nature, I don't want to add too much to what Shalon said, except that one thing capitalism does, compartmentalizes everything. So in like, if you're studying in school, there's a saying like, you know more and more about less and less. So you're very stuck in a like narrow fields. And I think what Trotsky's getting at here is we need to break down a lot of these barriers, between industry and nature, between art and industry, and really just kind of reintegrate that. Part of alienation is like the fragmentation of people and their interests. Your labor is something that belongs to someone else, as Marx says, whereas like your animal functions of eating, drinking, and sleeping are what belong to you. But under communism, kind of reintegrate all that. And I think that's partly what Trotsky is trying to get at there. And that this would, we could be able to use like this industry to create wonderful art, and certainly, hopefully, in a more ecologically sustainable way as well.
I was just thinking about the relationship maybe between Trotsky and Marx when he says in these sort of economic and political manuscripts something about how needs change with each kind of new sort of system. So it's not like we have one set of needs. Those always remain the same, but they change with different political systems. And I suppose there's a similar relationship to the way that nature isn't something that's sort of fixed historically. It's sort of something that develops.
Nature, I mean, we do transform nature.
Yeah.
Just the fact that we have tools and are able to make things from tools transforms nature. The problem is, of course, like under capitalism, there's, if you just look at like, I'll give you an example again with the action figures. I know. Just to get an action figure, it's so much waste involved. There's like the cardboard packaging, the plastic packaging, and it's just so much wasteful. I mean, it's also, but that's something like that goes into the production costs and everything. And I'd imagine if we still actually had action figures under communism, maybe not, but if we did, I'd imagine we could get rid of like a lot of this excess waste that goes into just so much production of art. And, you could take a different, avenue, different whatever of art and just say like, what is actually wasteful? And another thing is just like advertising itself. How much of art, is about the advertising? If you watch the American Super Bowl, it's like how many millions to get a commercial? Like all that kind of excess, we could just get rid of, under communism. You could watch, your Netflix without having to get all the different streaming services. It could just all be in one place. I think that's actually a great possibility that, yeah, capitalism has created this wonderful technology, but it misuses it and it poisons the world, and we could change that.
There's also the thing you were saying about authenticity. I've just been reading The New Spirit of Capitalism by Boltanski and Chiapello, where they sort of talk a bit about how sort of capitalism starts to develop ways of making you feel like you have sort of, I think Zizek actually said things like this. You start to sort of, capitalism starts to sort of talk about, build authenticity into the actual product so that you sort of feel more like you get your sense of authenticity from a certain thing, or it's hand woven or something else. Those start to become part of the culture industry as we sort of keep going back to. Where Trotsky makes room for a lot of kind of cultural pluralism in art, the Chinese Cultural Revolution was an attack on those representatives of the bourgeoisie who have sneaked into the party, the government, the army, and various cultural circles. So in what respects is Mao's Cultural Revolution different from Trotsky's, and to what extent is the Maoist Cultural Revolution very particular to China?
For Trotsky, Cultural Revolution, it's kind of tied to his larger ideas on Soviet political developments in the 1920s. People need to inherit all the bourgeois culture. People need to be educated in order to be fit to rule. And this is, of course, tied to democratization of the party and the Soviets, and, of course, developing an economic planning system. So I think Trotsky is in many respects like following along a very classical Marxist line from Marx to Lenin himself. With Mao is Well, first of all, culture is very important in Mao's thought. Unlike a lot of traditional Soviet Marxism, which is very focused on like developing the productive forces and economics, Mao is very concerned with ideas of the superstructure. That's not true in Stalin. His whole idea of contradiction is basically like, it's not just the economic base that's determining. It's like sometimes the superstructure, culture, can be the determining factor. And in his talks at Enaa in the 40s, he's developing this. This is in the context of World War II. So the Japanese are invading, and Enaa is this kind of isolated, very poor region. And the party needs to mobilize workers, peasants, intellectuals, in this case, for the anti-Japanese war, for the wider force of national liberation. On the one hand, it's a very democratizing moment because a lot of Chinese intellectuals traditionally come from these very elite backgrounds. They're very divorced from popular struggles, because we have to keep in mind this was a country under an emperor just a few decades before. And suddenly all these intellectuals are in this remote region of China. And it's basically like intellectuals need to concern themselves with the conditions of the people, reflect those in their works, and promote it, in part of the anti-Japanese struggle. And there is, in a sense, like a very clear sense the party needs to mobilize. The party is determining the truth in that. Whereas Trotsky is certainly like, he doesn't certainly want like counter-revolutionary works represented, but basically if you're not overtly opposing the revolution, you should be allowed to do what you want, basically. And cultural mobilization is important to the eventual victory of the Chinese Communist Party. But the Cultural Revolution that Mao develops is also, it's so much of it is responding to what he conceives as what went wrong in the Soviet Union, and like what he sees could go wrong in China, which is the development of privileged elites in the party who are tied to old cultural ideas, who want to basically restore capitalism. It's his idea of how to combat capitalist restoration. So Mao basically saw that the Chinese Revolution had established, in his view anyway, a socialist economic base of a planned economy and whatever. But old ideas still lingered, these privileged ideas of deference, of authoritarianism and whatnot. And they were still there, and they threatened to essentially grab hold of people in the party, and those people would use those old ideas to transform the country back to capitalism. This is very simplistic, but he had essentially said that's what happened in the Soviet Union, that they had restored capitalism. So basically in 1966, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, which is transform, get rid of old ideas, get rid of these people in the party and the state who are capitalist rotors, as he says, tear them down and, get the people in charge, and we can make the superstructure match the base. In fact, it's not just that. It's like, once we revolutionize ideas, we can speed up the development of the productive forces. There's actually a slogan, grass revolution, promote production, at one point. And certainly in the Cultural Revolution, it's never like there's a stereotype that they basically destroyed all the old Chinese culture, which is certainly Red Guards did that, but it was never like official policy. And if you go to China now, you can still see old cultural landmarks. So they certainly didn't destroy it all. But there is a promotion, especially Mao's wife, in fact, of promoting like more authentic, like they think more authentically working class and peasant artwork, and trying to not put on like as many old Chinese plays. They try and put on they don't develop too many movies. One they do make is called Breaking with Old Ideas, which is like this very pro-cultural revolution idea of like how the communists are going to change education, and it prevents a very idealized view of like what a party cadre should be, of serving the people and whatnot. But basically, Trotsky is considering cultural revolution within the context of essentially the platform of the left opposition in the 20s, and is part of a wider idea for socialist transformation and, Soviet democracy. It's partly that, whereas Mao is really concerned with this cultural revolution as part of a wider attack on capitalist restoration and driving the revolution forward.
The actual Chinese Cultural Revolution was also a very tumultuous period in Chinese political history. how should we think about this in relation to China and the development of the Chinese Communist Party?
You're right, it's very tumultuous. I think one thing we should think about the Cultural Revolution, it's not just, I think there's a very vulgar way to think about it as Mao essentially controlling everything that's going on. Not true. He certainly launches it, his prestige and cult of personality are ever present in it. But the Red Guards, a lot of them are doing their own thing, and it becomes very chaotic. The current Chinese Communist Party essentially dismisses the whole period. And I'm not saying that we should embrace it. There's a lot of stuff there that the Red Guards did some very foolish things and had some ideas I don't think we should embrace. But it did, if you read some literature, it helped bring education and healthcare to a lot of rural regions. There was some interesting experiments on workers' control of industry. And there was a real attempt to, push these kind of cultural experiments. I mean, what the quality of it, may vary. But, as we've mentioned, socialism doesn't necessarily guarantee good art. I think one thing, though, that the Cultural Revolution does not institutionalize any form of socialist democracy. And there is, unfortunately, a lot of the radical impetuses of the Chinese Revolution essentially exhaust themselves in this period. So I think at best our view should be very mixed. I think an upholding of the Cultural Revolution is not something I would do. Let me just put it that way.
He is quite interesting. He seems to say it's a failure, but he also wants to try and salvage something.
Badu, yes. So he really likes the Shanghai Commune, which is definitely the high phase of the Cultural Revolution. They're trying to imitate the Paris Commune, but Mao backs away from that and just reinstitutionalize or tries to revitalize the party and state. And I think Badu, he kind of notices that Mao's in a bind. He's certainly a rebel against this type of state, but he doesn't want to tear it down completely.
Yeah, it's almost like Badu doesn't like the role of the party, but almost wants the sort of insurgency of the revolution, I guess.
Yeah, and that's actually a debate in wider currents of Maoism. How much of the ideas of these mass organizations of the Cultural Revolution should you embrace before the seizure of power as opposed to after the seizure of power, where you're more traditionally Stalinist or Leninist or what have you?
So one of the things I find really interesting about Maoism and the Cultural Revolution is the way that the thought of Mao and even references and iconography from the revolution are taken up in very different contexts. So, for example, we find elements of Maoism in sort of 60s counterculture, third worldist movements, philosophy of Badiou and the cinema of Godard. And I was also just recently thinking of consciousness raising with sort of in feminist work. So I suppose, to what extent is there something in Maoism that sort of transcends the sort of historical particularities?
If Shalon doesn't mind, I'm going to go first. So basically, in terms of the 60s, China's the most populous country in the world. And after 1956, the Soviet Union is not super attractive to a lot of people, whereas China it's trying something different. And the Cultural Revolution is this kind of high point. There's definitely, I think, a lot of myth and looking at things through rose-colored glasses that a lot of people do abroad. But it certainly was, in pretty much every respect, China is better off than it was before 1949. And if Maoism is at its high point in the 60s and 70s, Godard, as Shalon and I talk about, French intellectuals, privileged French intellectuals are trying to wonder how they can serve the people. And you see this repeated throughout universities in Western Europe and the United States. But Maoism isn't just appealing to those people. The Black Panthers in the US, they're selling, the Red Book to raise money. And you're right, consciousness raising is in the feminist movement. And you see splits from various mainline communist parties that are fairly moderate or conservative, who are, a lot of those parties are, trying to live the spirit, as they think, live the spirit of the Chinese Revolution, starting armed struggles, depending on the country we're talking about. But China is very present in the 60s. I think when we look at the period of the 60s, Badiou calls it the Red Decade, the Cultural Revolution and Maoism actually has to be very prominent in that, because it really was a pole of attraction. However, mythologized it may have been, however much people were looking through it through rose-colored glasses or whatnot, it really was this just pole of attraction that really helped revitalize and give. It's why so many people adopted various forms of Marxism, Leninism. It's because of China and, obviously Vietnam and Cuba and what have you.
It does all kind of come back to Godard's film La Chinoise that Doug and I wrote an article about in Cosmonaut called A Fight on Two Fronts. So it kind of brings our whole conversation.
Brilliant, by the way. Sorry.
Thank you.
It's really, really fascinating. I do recommend it if anyone hasn't read it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, as Doug can attest, that almost became a book. We had to cut actually a lot out of it. This does kind of come back to the conversation, we've come full circle talking about art again. Just to kind of summarize the movie in case people here haven't seen it, but I think it's free online, so definitely check it out. La Chinoise is a movie 1967 by Godard, and it's about a small university student age led Maoist collective, and it essentially just follows their collective. I won't say too much about the plot so that you watch it, but the movie itself is a way that Godard was trying to actually present revolutionary art. So he was a socialist and very adjacent to Maoist movements happening in France at the time. And he wanted to figure out how he could make film be revolutionary. And his two influences for that were, as Doug said, one was Mao and Maoism, the other was Brecht. So he sort of pulled from two different but both radical figures when he was making this film. And with Brecht, he's essentially working with Brecht's alienation effect, where he often has the actors talk directly to the camera, break the fourth wall. He does a lot of Brechtian kinds of things where he's juxtaposing things that shouldn't make sense together, but they do in context. So it's a very odd film if you're not familiar with that kind of filmmaking, but it is a great example of, at the time, of someone trying to actually make revolutionary cinema in the 60s, like not just coming out of Soviet Russia, but actually in France and trying to make cinema that would prompt people to revolution. But coincidentally, he's also simultaneously critiquing some of the student-led movements and some of the radical movements happening in the late 60s at the time as well. So it's a strange mix of both satire and propaganda, which Godard really tried to do with that. So,
I mean, the thing I find fascinating about La Chinoise, which I first saw 5 years ago, is it really poses these real questions that revolutionaries need to confront. Like, how do privileged intellectuals serve the people? How do we revolutionize education? In some respects, the film mocks it, like what they're doing, and satirizes it. But there's still real questions. And the film, and even if you're not a Maoist of any sort, they're actually, whatever branch of Marxism you fall under, you have to confront them in one way or the other. And there's interesting questions in it about, like, how much of class suicide, these intellectuals, like they're living in a very abstract world. One of their members is basically serving as a maid, and we face that in our real movements as well. Like, we may say we're all equal and comrades, but is a certain group just doing the dishes and others not? And it's just kind of fascinating too. But it's also, Godard also deals with these real life implications of, like, how do we have solidarity with the third world? How do we fight, like, these institutionalized party structures that are counter-revolutionary, like the Communist Party in France? And what role do students play? I just think there's so much in it, and I can't get into it all because I know, like, time is limited, but definitely read our essay and feel free to send us personally feedback, because we love to hear it. But we tried to get into a lot of this because there actually isn't a super lot of Marxist commentary on La Chinoise, which is sad.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating. I think even though it is a sort of critique and it's a satire, you never feel like it's a satire that's coming from sort of outside of Marxism of some kind. It's always it seems like it's a sort of a critique, a self-critique of some kind.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, it's more of like a self-critique because he was directly connected to those movements happening at the time and worked, helped to promote party pamphlets and things like that. He was even introduced to some of the key players by the key actors in the film. So he's definitely doing a internal kind of satire, but also at the same time trying to challenge the film industry. He wants to uproot capitalism. He's anti-imperialist, so he's trying to pack all of that into one film. And I recommend, of course, reading our essay, but also, of course, watching it because people might find it kind of a different kind of film than they're used to if they're not familiar with Godard.
Well, the aesthetics and the use of color is just really interesting as well. I mean, separate from the politics, I mean, it is just a really very particular aesthetic, I think.
Very. And, personally, like from personal artistic opinion, Godard's not one of my favorite film directors. He's someone who I recognize as intellectually important for the history of cinema. Personally, I appreciate his films more for the political and satirical aspect, but I don't necessarily want to watch them over and over and over. But for those who are listening who aren't too familiar, from a cinematic perspective, Godard was one of the most radical filmmakers and completely changed the language of cinema, the way that cinema had become very formulaic, and he really uprooted that. And partly in part because he was studying a lot of semiotics at the time, people like Levi Strauss and Barth, who and learning a lot about how images can be used in filmmaking. So Godard is very important for both the political reasons, but also for the artistic reasons.
I'm really pleased to actually talk a little bit about Maoism, because it's sort of a really interesting topic, and it's something that I think I'm quite curious about, really. I don't really know. I think most of my Maoism sort of comes from maybe a bit of Badiou, maybe a little bit of really Mao himself. It's interesting that you're able to go into some of those areas and also go into sort of things like Mao, and at the same time reading Adorno, because a lot of the time those things don't necessarily get read together.
Yeah. No, Maoism, I think, at least lately, is not super studied on the Western left, when it's been very influential for better or for worse. It's produced a lot of fascinating movements and figures, from Badiou to Charles Bettelheim to Godard to whomever.
Yeah, no, I think so. Are you structuring your book as a sort of history, the survey on them?
Our project on Marxism and Cultural Revolution. So Doug and I, we've written things together before, and as we were through many conversations we've had about culture and the culture industry and these different films and stuff we talked about, we realized that the concept of a revolution in culture is something that is not talked about as much as you would think, even though culture plays a major part in every aspect of our life. So we wanted to initially write a book that was a survey of how different Marxist writers treated the concept of culture. But it sort of has, that became too big of a project, and it now evolved into just talking about the necessity of a revolution in culture. And so it's going to be a little more slimmed down. That's basically that. And as you know, both Doug and I write a lot and are very busy. I work full time and also go to school full time. So, and so does Doug. So we're both very busy. So it's, slow moving, but it's still coming along. So it's just sort of evolving as we gather more information. We often realize we have too much to talk about.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit www.explodingappendix.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, Instagram, or Twitter. Exploding Appendix, Ideas in Culture.